This is part 3 of our video on finding midpoints. Last video, we learned that when you have the endpoints of a segment and you would like to find the midpoint of that segment, all you're going to do is average. So you're going to take your x coordinates, 1x from each endpoint, and you're going to average them, meaning you're going to add them and divide by 2. You do that for the x's and the y's, and you're going to get each x and y coordinate of the midpoint. So that midpoint formula allows us to find the midpoint of a segment if we know the endpoints of the segment. But what happens if we know the coordinates of the midpoint and we know the coordinates of one of the endpoints? You think we can find the coordinates of the other endpoint? Yeah, sure you can. Well, what you're basically going to do is you're going to work backwards. Here's an example. It's listed as a hard example. M being the midpoint of segment AB, find the coordinates of the endpoint B. So notice how they show you that M, which is the midpoint, lives at 5, -7. That's down there in quadrant 4. Point A lives at the ordered pair 1, 4. That's in quadrant 1. So that segment is going to extend through the midpoint down to point B. So point B lives further down and to the right in quadrant 4. We know it's in quadrant 4, but we don't know its coordinates. And that's what we need to find. So we're going to work backwards to do that. So when you find the midpoint, you're averaging, you're adding and dividing by 2. What would be the backwards version of that? We're going to multiply by 2, and then we're going to subtract. So hopefully you'll follow that. If you look at the coordinates of the midpoint M, 5, -7, you're going to double those, multiply by 2. So 5 times 2 is 10, and then subtract the x coordinate. So 10 minus 1 is 9. So point B is going to have an x coordinate of 9. Do the same thing for the y values. Go to the midpoint. The y value is -7. Multiply it by 2. So you get -14. Then subtract the y value of the endpoint that you know. -14 minus 4. So it'd be -18. Point B is going to live at 9, -18. Isn't that going to be further down in quadrant 4? Definitely. You can pause this video if you want. Take a look at number 10. Work out number 10 using that same strat. Start with the midpoint, multiply by 2, then subtract the coordinates of the endpoints. Okay, so if you work that out, hopefully you got this answer. Let's talk about it here. I'm going to take the x value of the midpoint, the 8, and multiply by 2. So I get 16. I'm going to take that 16 and I'm going to subtract the x coordinate of my endpoint, which is 18. 16 minus 18. That gives me -2 for my x coordinate of point B. That means my answer is either B or C in this multiple choice option. Do the same thing with the y now. The y coordinate of the midpoint is -9. Multiplied by 2, you get -18. Then subtract the y coordinate of the endpoint. That's -21. So we need -18 minus -21. You can type the calculator if you have to. of you might know what this is. Negative 18 minus a negative 21 is like negative 18 plus 21. That gives you positive 3. So your answer there should have been B. That's using the strategy that we just talked about. Now, since this was multiple choice, you could have made it a whole lot easier on yourself. If you don't like going backwards, you could have went forward. So use the endpoint A, that's the 18, negative 21 ordered pair. Pretend that the other endpoint is option B, negative 2 and 3. What happens if you average those two endpoints? You better get the midpoint that's 8, negative 9. Let's check it. 18 plus negative 2, that's 16. 16 divided by 2, that's that 8 we were looking for. Negative 21 plus 3, that's negative 18. Negative 18 divided by 2 is negative 9. And that's what we wanted. Okay, so you can use the midpoint formula backwards to find coordinates of endpoints. If you know a midpoint and an endpoint and you need the other endpoint, that's the strategy that you use.